To start, I wish to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am currently located, Meanjin or Brisbane. I pay my respects to all elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, recognising that these lands have always been places of meeting, collaboration and learning. Hello, I'm Helen Christensen. I'm an Industry Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney. Yes, even though I'm located in Brisbane at the moment. So I'm going to talk today about community engagement practitioners. So as a means of an overview for this next 30 minutes, I'm going to give you a little bit of context. I'm going to show you very quickly some of the existing literature in this space, a quick overview of my methodology, and then some of the major findings around what we know about community engagement practitioners, the types that exist, as well as the tensions that they experience in practicing community engagement. So by means of motivation, and this is kind of relevant, I am a researcher, so I've recently completed my PhD in the practice and professionalisation of community engagement with a focus on local government. I'm also a practitioner, so I have industry experience, work as an IAP2 trainer, have worked in local government and so forth. And of course, there's a little bit of me that's confused. I've also got a note there that I'm a former teacher, which is relevant to this space because in my teaching years, I had 4 years of sort of training of on-the-job practice, as well as a lot of theory around content and how to practice teaching. Whereas with community engagement, the people's pathways in are a little bit different, and I'm keen to know what people are drawing on and the decisions that they're making and how this is sort of affecting community engagement and the wider quality of our democratic practice. So in terms of the problem, essentially there is a lot of legislation that's requiring public institutions to engage, ranging from really standard stuff like a 28 display and public submission processes through to more kind of innovative methodologies such as the deliberative ones. Now, it is a significant driver for practice. It's something I wrote a really riveting paper on. But as a result, with all of this kind of requirements, these legislative drivers, there is a growing sort of participatory and deliberative practice, or more kind of colloquially known as community engagement. As a result, there are lots of practitioners. And my argument is that these practitioners are really important because they design, they deliver, they report on, they evaluate, and they essentially make a living or earn a profit from making, designing and being involved in these participatory democracy processes. So the role of the practitioner is a really tricky one. Friedson, who's quite well known for his work around professionals and professionalisation, puts forward the idea that professionals use their knowledge and skills to serve individuals or the needs of a client or employer. My argument is that it's a little bit tricky if you're a community engagement practitioner because you're typically serving the needs of both your community as well as your client or your employer at exactly the same time. So if you are seen to favour the community, the organisation will kind of take issue with that. And likewise, the other way around, if you are seen to kind of favour the organisation, the community will often view the process as a bit of a sham. So they're kind of stuck in the middle. It's a very interesting and very unique position for that reason. Now, these community engagement practitioners, there has been some research on them in the past. Prior to 2006, there's not a lot. They were just seen as a variable in kind of community engagement and community consultation type processes. There was some early research done by Hendricks and Carson around the commercialisation of the market and the kind of forming of a community of practice, all these people that do this work. There's been some work from the UK and Germany, and there's been some work from an academic, Caroline Lee, in North America, looking at how professionalisation in some instances has come at the cost of addressing the democratic deficit that it was kind of designed to address in the first place. Since then, there's also been some more work. So there was a symposium a few years ago now, and as a result of that, kind of a short guide came out, and then a larger book which looks at lots of different examples of how professionalisation, how practitioners work kind of, internationally, focusing on everything from their micro skills to how institutions work and the effect and impact that has on practice. There is also other bits and pieces. So there's some work around how influential practitioners can be on community engagement, community consultation processes. So it ranges from things such as, practitioners are this amazing group of people and everything they do is wonderful, through to, well, actually, they can influence the process unduly. They can steer groups in certain directions. So a bit to be considered there. And that quote at the bottom there is probably one that I consider a bit in my practice, in terms of, the facilitators are influenced by professional norms that they've learned through training and their direct experiences. And of course, with lots of different sorts of training, lots of different experiences, lots of different backgrounds, the practice is quite diverse and quite broad, or at least I sort of suspected heading into the research. So the research that I'm going to be presenting today is based on two major kind of methods, and when you put them together, it's known as an explanatory mixed method approach. So there was essentially a survey which was predominantly quantitative that was done in mid-2017. It was open to everybody who self-identified as working in community engagement. So we received 375 responses. It's very difficult to know how many practitioners there would be. Some, of course, double, some have oversight, and some are kind of in it as their full-time jobs. But if we were to assume that the population of practitioners is about 15,000, we could be relatively confident with these results. But like I said, there's no way of actually knowing how large that sample is. The second major piece of major method that this research is drawn on is semi-structured interviews that were conducted in late 2018. So reflecting on the results from the survey, a number of senior practitioners were approached to participate, a mix of public, of private, but typically people that worked in or with public institutions, seeking a kind of diversity of views, and 20 interviews were conducted. So this kind of presents those findings. Now, the first sort of half of the findings is around the type of practitioners, so who they are, where they come from, and the different types, and it draws from an article that was published late last year in the Journal of Public Deliberation. This one's actually freely available, so if you're a good Googler, you can go and find it. And I've got a couple of extra bonus slides in here as well. So in terms of the cohort, demographically, and keeping in mind this is just the survey of 375 from a few years ago, the cohort demographically is very female, so just over 3/4 there identify as female, kind of just over a fifth as male in there. So Australia-wide, female workforce participation is just under half, so females are represented comparatively, which is an interesting finding in and of itself. It sort of lends itself to this idea that it might be a gendered profession like teaching or nursing, bringing, the multitude of issues with that as well, but something that wasn't explored as part of this research. Demographically, the practitioner cohort is pretty white. So, you'll see that sort of highest marker down there are those which don't strongly identify with a cultural or ethnic group, followed by those of Northwest European kind of ancestry. Now, the ones with the little asterisks that you can kind of see on your screen there are the ones that are underrepresented when compared with the Australian population as a whole. But keep in mind that the sample size isn't huge. So these little bumps are kind of, could be anything to sort of 1 to 2 or 3 people. But observation would sort of dictate as well that it is predominantly not the most diverse of cohorts. Demographically, in terms of employment situations, most of them are employees, or those that responded to the survey were employees inside an organisation. Some worked for themselves, some worked inside a small business or kind of ran their own small business, or some of them for the larger consultancy firms. Also, many of them were local government employees. So you'll see, just over half there identify as working in a local government. Some of them were owner-managers, some work in state governments, and then private sector, different size enterprises through to sort of federal government and higher education, but definitely skewing towards local government. The next demographic marker was around the qualifications. So the practitioner cohort are pretty well educated. So you'll see there that over a third have got postgraduate qualifications. Nearly a third have got bachelor degrees as their minimum. Australia-wide, about 22% of Australians have got a bachelor's or above, whereas our community engagement practitioners, half have a bachelor's or above, so relatively well educated. This next slide's quite interesting. So we asked them what their qualifications were in, and there is a pretty diverse mix in there. So down the bottom there with the most kind of, in the high 30%, management qualifications were quite common, followed by public relations, communications and media, with about a third of practitioners having qualifications in that area, followed by community development, followed by social science, followed by social or community planning or research, followed by organisational development. So I won't read them all out, but you can see for yourselves, but it's a pretty diverse mix the way that people have come into this area. And you'll note up the top there, it says 2.7 each, which means that people have 2.7 qualifications and often in different areas. So coming from, some really diverse backgrounds into community engagement. Now, these next few slides are bonus data. They weren't included in the article in the interests of word counts and getting things published. But I asked the question of, what do you call somebody who works in community engagement? Are they a practitioner? Are they a facilitator? Are they a professional? Are they an expert? And you'll see the results on your screen there. Practitioner may be leading, but not a lot of consensus in terms of, if you think to other kinds of professions like teaching or nursing, there's often a sort of straight answer, whereas in this area, the responses are more diverse. We also asked participants how they would describe community engagement. It has been referred to as a community of practice and a profession and a field in the past. And we've added some other ones in there as well. You'll see there's not a lot of consensus. Is it a discipline? Is it enough to be a profession? Is it a movement? So a bit of diversity in responses there. And the final kind of bonus data was we asked participants if community engagement is viewed as a profession outside of community engagement circles. So the answer generally was no. People don't understand what it is or why we do it was kind of put in the qualitative responses that accompanied this question. Whereas those that said yes or that they were unsure said, well, I have a job, there are roles, people offer me contracts in this area, which would suggest that it very much is a kind of profession. So moving on to the more qualitative responses to the survey, we asked practitioners what informed their practice. So previous work experience, study and training was kind of one area. So people spoke about their backgrounds in social work, in policy, in public administration, in community development, how they drew on that experience and the knowledge that they gained. They spoke a lot about how they learned on the job, including from mistakes. They spoke about training and short courses that they had undertaken. As for whether their formal qualifications contributed to how they practice, there was a bit more divided. Some said that they drew really heavily, particularly on their kind of, early bachelor's degrees and so forth, whereas others said they don't think they use anything from their earlier qualifications, although I suspect they might. Individual traits were listed around capabilities, interests, personality types, and common responses were often around community engagement practitioners as individuals are typically people that are comfortable with ambiguity. Maybe it's because they work regularly with people whom aren't. They are good with flexibility and they have got a sort of strong values or principles base that they draw on in their practice were also key responses. So ultimately, kind of by looking at these demographics, this sort of mix of backgrounds, it is essentially a pretty broad church, right? Or a kind of motley crew, if you can get my age appropriate GIF reference there. So there is a wide diversity of knowledge and skills gained through formal and informal learning and workplace experience. It is unlike other areas like teaching and nursing, which are probably well established with degree programs, licensing and so forth, and registration requirements, but there's no core knowledge and skills in the practice. So I was really keen to explore the question of does this diversity in knowledge and experience put the community engagement practice and ultimately democracy at a disadvantage, or is it a good thing? So it was something that I asked those senior practitioners in their interviews, and to be honest, their responses were pretty mixed. So some thought that the different backgrounds was a great strength. We come with different different views, different trainings, different backgrounds, and all of that helps us make sense of the work that we're doing and helps us interact with diverse communities. Others were concerned that there wasn't assumed core knowledge and therefore that the practice variation was too great. I come from a land use planning background and I think this, whereas somebody else comes from a community development background and they approach it in this way. And as a result, it becomes quite broad. Interestingly, some practitioners held both of these views simultaneously. So they kind of talked themselves around in a circle of, the diversity of the backgrounds is good, but the fact that there isn't a kind of core anchor as a sort of assumed knowledge base of what it is that community engagement is and what it is for, that is actually in itself a bit problematic. So that was kind of interesting to see in the interviews. We asked the practitioners in the interviews what the different types of practitioners were, and these next few slides will present essentially 3 key variables. They're not designed to say, oh, look, I'm that one on this one and that one on that one, and to create a typology. It's more to highlight the fact of the variation in practice around a few key areas. So in the first area, there were practitioners who were internal to the organisation. So these were typically employees of local, state, federal governments that were responsible for running public engagement, public consultation processes. And then there were what were essentially the consultants or the private practitioners who would be contracted to these public institutions to run these sorts of engagement processes. So there was a divide in terms of how the role was understood, in terms of the work that needed to be done, with a lot of the internal based practitioners taking on more of an organisational change piece, as well as having to advocate for the process and build people's understanding of it, whereas external practitioners, there was a view that a lot of the path had been cleared by the time that they arrived to do their engagement practice on behalf of an organisation. So that kind of divide was the first one that was noted. The second one was around the sort of work that practitioners do. So some practitioners work on processes with quite limited scope. So projects where many of the big decisions had been previously made, maybe by kind of elected representatives, ministers and so forth. And the scope around the project is a little bit more limited. So it might be things around timings and colours and those sorts of smaller negotiables, whereas some practitioners had the ability and access to work on processes where they were a bit more open-ended. So the negotiables were much larger and much warranted much deeper conversations. They might be policy decisions, program decisions, everything was kind of up for discussion. So that was seen as another kind of divide within the practitioner community, keeping in mind some work across both, some double in one or the other, but the process work often varied how they did their role. The third and final kind of variable were some practitioners worked on, were kind of in and out with their projects. So they worked on limited time frame projects, I've called them. So they come in, they run the process, they, help the organisation with the recommendations and they leave, whereas others were more kind of programmatic in that they might be running different projects, but they're often based in that community or they're based in there for a very long period of time that often changed the way that they went about doing their practice. Now, the kind of second section of this presentation that I'm now moving into is around what practitioners struggle with. And this is from an article that was published late last year in the Journal of Sociology, which draws really heavily on those interviews that I mentioned earlier, with predominantly keeping in mind senior practitioners. So the practitioners were asked what their tensions were. So the questions more specifically were what's making it difficult or challenging to deliver good engagement? What type of tensions or dilemmas do you face in your work and how do you manage these? So the first major theme in this area was, and across the board for all types of practitioners, was the sort of, serving the employer or the client on one side versus serving the community on the other. So there was an earnest desire from everyone that was interviewed to deliver meaningful engagement that satisfied the needs of both parties, with many of the practitioners, although not all of them, keen to appear neutral. So referring to that sort of rock and a hard place, one of the respondents spoke about this idea that you need to keep everybody happy, which might not necessarily be possible. This kind of continued on to this idea that they were working for the other side based on the perception. So, the organisations thought that practitioners were working against the aims of the organisation or the project. They were slowing it down, or they were going to prevent it from happening or making it more difficult. Whereas the sort of flip side of the coin is that communities often viewed practitioners as there to meet those project outcomes and align to the organisation, and consequently not super keen to hear what the communities have got to say. The note, Australian practitioners are quite interesting. They don't talk as much about neutrality as some of the overseas literature does. They do tend to use the word independent quite a bit though. So I did ask them what they were seeking to appear independent from. Was it about the subject matter, whether that was the kind of project or decision to be made, and that was important to most? Was it about independence from the organisation, and that once again was important to most? And I also asked them about independence from the community, and that was important to some, but not all. Some sort of saw their role as a kind of double agent to get the community, sneak them into processes and involve them as much as possible, be an advocate for them, which is interesting. So in terms of this kind of dichotomy of these, serving these two masters, previous research suggests that that practitioners are balanced between this, needing to run good process, but also needing to make a living. However, I would suggest it's probably a lot more nuanced than that. So how the practitioner is perceived, who their employer is, who their communities are, and how they position themselves all has an impact on, where that balance and how it's kind of tipping. So one of the other major findings around this area as well was around public sector employees and private contractors, and how they saw the role as different. So public practitioners spoke about internal barriers, predominantly being resistance from other staff. Why do I have to do this engagement stuff? And resistance from senior management, executives and decision makers, which is similar to research findings from overseas, particularly some of the stuff in the UK. The interesting bit that we kind of came across in this research, though, was that there were also a lot of concerns about job security. So this idea of, I really kind of want to push back on this. I don't think it's very good. I don't think it's good enough for our communities or good enough for the process. But, I'm scared if I keep doing this all the time, they'll just find somebody and replace me with somebody who's more compliant. So that was interesting. Private practitioners, of course, were generally more reserved in their responses, which isn't surprising. But there was that concern, which is quite nicely captured in that quote of, are they going to pay me for coming up with the wrong answers? And that point from earlier, that generally it was perceived as a little bit more easy because the path had been cleared. And they also found it easier to remain impartial if they weren't located in a long-term kind of capacity inside the community or inside that organisation. And just as a little tidbit, interestingly, public practitioners didn't think the grass was greener as a private practitioner, and private practitioners didn't think the grass was greener as a public practitioner. The final kind of major theme from this research, and there's quite a bit around this one, is what I've sort of diplomatically called the constraints and behaviours of public institutions. So these are the tensions that practitioners face because public institutions are, wild and unwieldy beasts at times. And there were 8 of these, which are kind of counted down on this screen and the next. So they talk about when practitioners agree with the community, they experience that as a tension in terms of, well, we told you this, we thought this was a good idea, and now the organisation's doing that, and practitioners are often, I don't know why they did it either, which they struggle with. Number 7 was around when practitioners lack authority. I think I call in the paper, but it's actually probably more around autonomy, in terms of, it's really important for me to be transparent and answer questions and so forth, and somebody's asked me a question here, but I don't know if I'm allowed to give the answer. I don't know if I have the authority to do that, if I should ask my boss. So there's that kind of hesitation, and they experience it as a tension. Practitioners also struggled with when the engagement was perceived to be as tokenistic, so where there was little or no influence given to the community. So some of the practitioners tended to accept it as the nature of the work, like I don't like it, but it happens every now and then, we have to do it. Whereas others, really build their brand and their reputation around avoiding that sort of work. They don't want to be linked with it. They want to build their name and their reputation around doing, more impactful and not tokenistic perceived work. Number 5 was around when the bureaucracy and the decision makers aren't aligned. So this refers predominantly when, if you think about when contractors or when practitioners are sort of brought in and they get really excited about the opportunity to do an engagement process, but it turns out that the decision makers have already made a decision or they want to take the project in a different direction. So often quite a bit of work happens until that realisation is made, which is a bit of a frustration. Number 4 is around when decision makers are not fully committed to or understanding of the process. There's often a desire where decision makers want to be seen to be doing engagement, but not fully cognizant of the fact that, well, once you do engagement, there is an expectation that you listen, that you show that you've listened, which, ultimately means having influence over processes. There were some comments around senior public servants and political advisors interfering with processes, really being driven from a desire to manage risk. So it was often, stories like we presented the community engagement report and, a senior executive member wanted us to take out, some of the findings because they weren't in line with the decision makers, whereas the practitioners were like, well, that's what the community said, so I don't feel that I can, edit it or censor it in any way. It tended to come at that senior public servant or political advisors level. Number 2 was around when public institutions are unsure of how to balance community and expert views, and that was common in the more sort of science and environment institutions where, we're going out and asking the community, but we also have a lot of knowledge. Who do we ask what questions to and what kind of weighting do we give them is something that those organisations struggle with. And this last one is predominantly centred around consultants when they say we do an amazing process, we get the community really excited, they're really involved, it's inclusive, it's excellent, we make recommendations, and then the project ultimately gets shelved and nothing happens with it. So we've kind of gone out there, built our name and our reputation around getting everything ready, and then it all sort of falls over a little bit. Which can obviously be quite frustrating. So obviously this warrants the question of, well, how do managers manage these tensions? I'm just going to edit that now because I don't want to film the whole thing again. So how do they manage these tensions? And there were ultimately 3 strategies that were employed, although it wasn't a kind of consistent, systematic approach. There was typically 3 things that I identified that they would draw on. So the first strategy was around avoidance. So when they realised that, maybe the decision makers weren't on board, maybe the process hasn't been scoped properly, whatever it was, there was often I'm really sorry, I can't help you with that one, I'm quite busy at the moment. This is of course much easier for external consultants rather than people inside an organisation. There's only so long that you could use that strategy. If the avoidance strategy isn't available or it hasn't kind of worked, practitioners then move to what I call prevention, but it's actually more preparation. So it's getting the organisation, getting the decision makers and key staff ready for what's going to happen, right? So the community might say this, they might say that, don't overreact when this happens, get ready for these sorts of responses, think about what you might say. So getting the organisation and those key players ready. And if that doesn't work or doesn't kind of serve its purpose or it's a little bit unpredictable, the third and sort of final strategy is if we've tried everything that we can and it hasn't worked, then ultimately it's actually around having some difficult and frank conversations with either our employer or superior or the people that have contracted us to sort of work through these issues. Now, what's super interesting about these sorts of strategies is that essentially this research has been done with senior practitioners. So they did, and I also did obviously in the analysis, reflect on their position. So the fact that these are practitioners that are quite experienced, as a result, they're relatively confident. So they made reference themselves to, look, I probably wouldn't have stood up for this sort of thing in the past, but now I know when to pick my battles, which battles are more important than others in sort of advocating for good process inside their organisations. Position in the hierarchy is also, as I just gave in that example, important in terms of, if I'm a junior staff member and I don't think it's a good approach, I'm not as confident and as experienced at being able to speak up and highlight that. Relationships with senior leaders and decision makers were also seen as important for facilitating some of these strategies and managing these processes, and also the organisational understanding and profile of community engagement. So in an organisation where the field might be quite new, the practice might be quite new, it was considered more difficult to advocate for good process when people didn't really know fully what it was. a lot of the practitioners, or not all of them, made reference at some point to the principles or the values that they use in making decisions of when is a good time to advocate for a better process, be it, higher involvement, a longer time, a better question, or whatever. And they reflected on the principles and values that they use in their own practice. So, for example, if they're super keen to be seen as transparent, then they let that guide them. What do I do in this position? Well, that's not a very transparent response, and therefore I'm going to advocate for it to be more transparent. So it's often democratic principles along the lines of, transparency, inclusiveness, representation of diverse voices, and so forth. So quite an interesting finding, particularly when you consider that these are senior practitioners. So for those, and if I kind of go back to that previous slide, for those that aren't as experienced, aren't as confident, don't sit as high in the hierarchy, if they're kind of met with opposition to good process, their principles and values aren't as firmly established, how do they make those decisions? Do they go along with it and hope for the best, or do they kind of put their cases forward? But regardless, quite interesting, and sort of highlights the difficulty of working inside public institutions and bureaucracies and everything that brings with them. So it's been quite a sort of short talk. I have my email up on the screen, happy to be contacted, because essentially what I've given you is a 30-minute version of probably about a quarter of my PhD. But thank you very much for listening. If you've made it to the end, it's been great to have you. So thank you.